Well, do you guys know about Operation Mockingbird? Yeah, it's where the CIA clandestinely worked in news organizations, infiltrated them, and tried to influence what Americans understood about the Cold War and God knows what else. And we never knew it. We never knew that these CIA operatives were working inside the New York Times and CBS News and other major media outlets. Well, now we know that Operation Mockingbird actually is still alive and well. You thought it went away? No, it didn't. Dan Cohen, redacted correspondent, is here to look at how Operation Mockingbird has really shifted over the years culturally and is operating sort of under a new flag. Dan, welcome to the show. What did you find?
Exactly. Well, it's just Operation Mockingbird under a different sort of name. So, what I'm going to show is how the Associated Press, one of the biggest outlets in media, and PBS are in bed with the US government, that they're not journalistic media outlets, but they're propaganda organs that essentially conceal their links to the US government. So these two outlets, AP and PBS, they run what they call the War Crimes Watch Ukraine, in which they claim to document war crimes in Ukraine, but you'll notice they only look at what they allege to be war crimes carried out by Russia, the geopolitical foe of the United States. They don't even bother to investigate Ukrainian war crimes. So right off the bat, we can see that they're only interested in war crimes so long as they can be used to advance a geopolitical agenda, which is maintaining public support for the United States' primary role in the war in Ukraine. So they track war crimes in order to keep the war going. It's kind of an irony. If their preferred side commits war crimes, which it certainly has, Ukraine, then they don't even bother. They just completely avoid it.
And there's been plenty of war crimes that we've covered here on this show. I mean, just examples off the top of my head. I mean, I remember Patrick Lancaster, friend of the show, was there moments after in a residential area of Ukraine, struck by shelling of residential zones all through Donetsk in the Donbass, and for no other reason. These were not military targets; they were residential areas. War crimes.
There have been so many. I mean, Patrick Lancaster has documented numerous Ukrainian war crimes carried out on the people of the Donbass. I remember that one vividly when Ukraine launched a Tochka-U ballistic missile and rained down cluster bombs over the center of downtown Donetsk and killed 22 people and maimed many more. And it was all on film. Patrick was there. So crimes like these, and he's continued to document many more, as have others, these go totally ignored by the AP and PBS and basically their partners, which I'm going to lay out right here. So if we look at the methodology tab of this war crimes tracker website, we see that the AP and PBS are in league with a series of groups that are fronts for the US government and its intelligence apparatus. I'm talking specifically about, I'm going to list them off, the Center for Information Resilience, Bellingcat, the Reckoning Project, the International Partnership for Human Rights, and the Ukrainian Healthcare Center. I'm going to focus on a few of these. The Center for Information Resilience, it's a UK firm. It's advised by former Estonian Foreign Minister Toomas Hendrik Ilves, who oversaw Estonia's ascension to NATO. And it's also advised by ex-CIA agent Cindy Otis. Maybe even more notorious, its vice president is the one and only Nina Yankovics, the head of Biden administration's short-lived Department of Homeland Security Disinformation Governance Board. And according to this magazine, Intelligence Online, the Center for Information Resilience actually hired Nina Yankovics in order to get funding from U.S. patrons. So very clear links to U.S. intelligence there. Its website freely, openly admits, it says, we have received grants from the UK government's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the US State Department, USAID, and Australia's Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade. So nothing about that funding in AP or PBS's reporting on Ukraine. Okay, so you only find that by doing some research. But if you watch any of the reports that they put out, they don't mention that at all. There's also Bellingcat, which everyone I think knows about by this point, the notorious disinformation outlet that takes money from the National Endowment for Democracy and is a favorite of US intelligence. And here, Bellingcat's founder, Elliot Higgins, promotes the AP and PBS's work on Buka. But of course, he doesn't say that they're relying on his organization for information. So kind of shady, tactic there to sort of conceal the links. And then we have PBS returning the favor, treating Higgins as some independent expert. So you can see this trickery. They don't really reveal anything. It's only kind of behind the scenes. Then we have AP and PBS's next partner, the Reckoning Project, which claims to train journalists to document Russian crimes in Ukraine. Well, this, like the others, is funded by USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, something called the Institute of War and Peace Reporting, which is also funded by USAID, the US State Department, and European governments. Okay, so then we have one more organization called the International Partnership for Human Rights, which is based in Brussels and is funded by the European Union, the Open Society Foundation, which is, of course, controlled and funded by billionaire George Soros. We have SIDA, which is the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, kind of like Sweden's USAID, and the National Endowment for Democracy. So, again, none of these government funders or ties are disclosed in AP or PBS's reporting. We're just supposed to believe they're acting on their own, doing this independent reporting.
Shouldn't there be some law, where we get this disclosure, or maybe in the FTC where we actually see these reports are funded by the CIA, in the same way that when we see these news reports about pharmaceuticals, when you dig deep into it, you realize that the funding for a lot of these news organizations comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Pfizer or Moderna, and we don't see that. That shows up on CNN's website as actual journalism, and it's actually not.
Exactly. It's amazing that there's no disclosure anywhere on television. I mean, PBS is supposed to be public television, right? Even though it's funded by a whole bunch of corporations, but none of this ever really gets talked about outside of independent media, where we hold their feet to the fire a little bit, and you see that there's no political will in Washington. I mean, there was a law that prevented the U.S. government from exposing, from subjecting its own citizens to government propaganda, but that was actually repealed, I believe, by the Obama administration. So all of this is I suppose, legal now. But you would think if there was some kind of political will in Washington, some members of Congress, then they might push back against these kinds of groups, against Bellingcat, which is, I think, the most prominent one that has played such a huge role in so many psyops that have pushed us to the brink of war, that have paved the way for this Ukraine war. From the Skripal incident, where Bellingcat played a central role, and I mean, there's so many others in Syria, in Ukraine also. So there's just no political will, and it's has very deleterious effects.
Well, also, too, from the broadcast side of things, right? Wouldn't it be great if you have on PBS NewsHour or these other quote unquote, the Associated Press or whatever it happens to be, even the mainstream media organizations like CBS or NBC or CNN or MSNBC or Fox, it doesn't really matter. When they have on a member of the military, former CIA, former member of the military, who's still on the take, who's still making money from the intelligence community, they don't disclose it at all. They just, here's a former member of the CIA, and here's on our air now. He's giving us answers about the Ukraine war right on our television now. It's not even hidden anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, the major sort of different years of Operation Mockingbird through kind of the early years, the late 40s and 50s and 60s of the Cold War, where Operation Mockingbird was covert. You had journalists, the CIA contacting journalists and basically getting journalists to create either false stories or run their stories by them. And that was all secretive. But now it's just kind of out in the open where, you go from, I mean, John Brennan is the perfect example, ex-CIA director who is in the media on a near daily basis, talking about why Putin would have, why Putin bombed the Nord Stream pipeline himself, and,
Yeah.
giving out all kinds of disinformation with total, if you wanted to have, I think at least, if you wanted to have intelligence or ex-intelligence on television, that's one thing, which is, questionable, but at least push back on them, ask them some difficult questions, hold them to their claims and their lies, ask them, demand they show evidence, proof, as a journalist or reporter should do. But it's always, they just defer to them like they're these, oracles of unquestionable knowledge. And so it just says everything about the media. And so now, it went from covert to now out in the open, celebrated. And it's sort of like a total cultural shift in Washington, where it's all just controlled by the CIA openly. And instead of like the cloak and dagger style secretive way, it's like they call it, democracy and free media. And, the Washington Post says, well, without this, democracy will die. It'll be in the darkness.
Yeah, that's their tagline. Democracy dies in the dark, which is crazy. And yeah, John Brennan is a perfect example. Here's a guy that literally is a CNN contributor. That's how they can introduce him, right? CNN contributor, former head of the CIA, John Brennan, joins us now, et cetera, et cetera. But what about his other connections? What about his other money that he's making from outside of CNN? Do we get to know about that? Do we also get to know what sort of connections he still has with the CIA, where they're feeding him information that he gets to just go on CNN and broadcast? None of that, and no pushback, because now you're a CNN contributor, and we're excited to have you on board, John. We're excited that you're now an employee of CNN. So I'm not going to ask you any tough questions. You're hanging out in the building. You're in the cafeteria with the rest of us, and that's how this works now. It's unbelievable, but this is how Operation Mockingbird has evolved. It's right in front of our faces.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so many other examples. Even more recent one, Jen Psaki, who went from White House press secretary, had a nice little break out of the public eye, and now she has her own show on MSNBC. After
Right.
so much disinformation for the for like the Biden administration, and then she just transitions perfectly. And it's just, this is like normal, accepted, standard practice in the media. And so it just shows, well, she was part of what was Tony Blinken's outfit, West Exec Advisors. She was
Right.
part of West Exec Advisors. So, which was basically part of the military industrial complex. Then she goes into the White House as press secretary, and then she goes into MSNBC. So this is like the military industrial media government complex. This is just one big animal that has just taken control of all media, which all mainstream media, which is why people more and more are turning to channels like Redacted or Russell, looking to Russell Brand or Jimmy Dore or alternative outlets where people are actually going to speak truthfully.
Yeah, that's right. It's so sad. So sad. Well, people are turning off CNN, and that's why CNN's ratings are in the toilet. And now there's word that the head of CNN, the new head of CNN, who just came in like a few months ago, is already on the chopping block. Word spreading through CNN headquarters that he's about to be fired. So, well, people don't want to watch propaganda. Dan Cohen, great to see you. Thank you so much for this report.
Thanks, Clayton.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover.